Te aviso. Bueno, le doy la bienvenida a todos. En nombre de la Escuela de Gobierno de la Universidad Austral, vamos a dar comienzo a una nueva jornada del Programa de Estudios Americanos, Entendiendo al Gobierno y la Política de los Estados Unidos. Hoy vamos a tratar el tema de seguridad global, rol de los Estados Unidos, básicamente, y temas de democracia versus autoritarismo. Tenemos aquí a nuestro coordinador académico, director del programa, Brian Bird, ex congresista de los Estados Unidos. Si está de acuerdo, Brian, para presentar nuestro primer panelista invitado, el contraalmirante Michael Smith.
Before I start, we heard that go down.
Yeah.
Excuse me, we're having some technical, but I'm going to go ahead and begin. Now well, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone here at the Universidad Austral, and also welcome our distinguished guests. We have had more than 20 speakers in this class, all of them outstanding, but none I'm more excited about than our speakers today. And we are so honored to begin. Our first speaker today is Rear Admiral Michael Smith. I will give a brief biography of Admiral Smith, then invite him to offer some comments. Michael Smith is the founder and director of National Security Leaders for America. He's a graduate of the Naval Academy. He commanded at all operation levels and completed combat tours in Desert Storm, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraqi freedom. His last operational tour was as commander, Carrier Strike Group 3, where he was responsible for the operations of over 8,000 personnel, 10 ships, and 70 aircraft. Admiral Smith was recognized as one of the Navy's premier strategists and served in its headquarters as the division director responsible for developing and implementing Navy strategy and policy. His education includes a degree from the United States Naval Academy, a master's degree in international negotiations, graduate study in nuclear engineering at the Air Command and Staff College. He is now embarked on a very important message to try to secure America's democracy from, actually in this case, sadly, from potential internal threats. And I will allow him and invite him to elaborate further on that. But please join me in welcoming United States Admiral Michael Smith. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian, and ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be able to speak with you today, especially on this topic, which, while I'm certainly not an expert in Argentine politics, nonetheless, in the United States, there certainly was a lot of press on your recent presidential election. So I look forward to this discussion. It's a little bit different from a Navy admiral, a retired Navy admiral talking to politics, but it just is the nature of where we find our political discourse in the United States, that a large group of senior national security leaders have come together in this mission. So if I could, Brian, if you could show a recent video that my organization put together that begins to describe, where we're coming from and what we're thinking at this point in our political cycle.
Happy to do it. We'll see if I can surmount any technical difficulties here. Wish me luck.
Okay.
That's cute.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
I took the same oath.
Our loyalty is to the Constitution, not a man.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Constitution.
Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help you God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
That is what makes American democracy special.
Patriotism, duty, honor, loyalty.
I've stayed out of politics my entire life, but I cannot stay silent.
I'm coming forward because our democracy is threatened.
When somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total.
Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy,
Which he will destroy because he didn't get his way.
Donald Trump has threatened vengeance if he's returned to power.
And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution.
That's un-American.
And against everything I swore to defend.
Patriotism means putting country before self. John F. Kennedy asked what you can do for your country.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Donald Trump demands his country do for him.
Trump puts himself first.
I served my country in uniform for 34 years.
I may be retired, but my oath still stands.
I will continue to defend American democracy
Until my last breath.
Thank you, Brian.
Stop the share. I don't know if I can.
Okay, thanks. And I'll bring up some slides. I'll try and show a very quick overview of what myself and my fellow members have been up to, and then I'd be happy to take any questions afterwards. So let me make sure this is showing. Can you see that okay?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. After retiring, I was part of a small group of retired admirals and generals who in 2016 saw Donald Trump as a threat and ended up supporting Hillary Clinton through op-eds and interviews. After the election and Donald Trump's victory, I helped keep our group together by co-founding a nonpartisan think tank that would advocate for critical national security issues. Over those next 4 years, we saw that Donald Trump was more than just a threat to national security policies. We felt that he and those he inspired had grown to become an existential threat to the future of our country as we knew it. So in March of our last presidential election year, I went to the Biden campaign and proposed establishing an all-volunteer organization that ultimately grew to over 1,000 former senior national security leaders. This included retired admirals and generals and senior enlisted. It included former ambassadors, and it included former cabinet secretaries, service secretaries, and career and elected leaders from across the national security establishment. This was a first of its kind organization. As I said, there were a small group of admirals and generals who in 2016 came to support Hillary Clinton's campaign for presidency, but at most that was 100 to 120 admirals and generals. From the beginning, this new group saw our strength coming from being a bipartisan group. So we were Democrats and Republicans and independents. And the fact is that as former national security leaders, we knew that our voices were trusted by voters. And as long as we maintained that bipartisanship and didn't become extreme, we believed that we could have an impact. And so our members ultimately were driven by their previous oaths to protect and defend our Constitution. Prior to 2016, I don't think any of us would have projected how our political system would become so polarized. And even something as basic as our American democracy would be cause for debate and the visceral hatred from, quote, the other side, unquote. Polling in the United States is quite clear. The democracy that I and my members swore to defend is in fact in great risk. Now, individually, overall, Americans consider themselves to be quite patriotic. But each side is concerned over a democracy that they feel isn't democratic and is failing them. 72% say that they don't have a great enough voice in our elected system. 84% of Trump Republicans and 51% of progressive Democrats have declining trust in the elections. 88% agree there should be more fairness in the electoral process. And over half, 52%, believe the two-party system doesn't work for them. The farther the generations go from those that fought in World War II or lived during the Cold War, the more this disenfranchisement grows, until what you see here, to most of us in our organization, we found shocking that half of the Americans under 40 would be open to a non-democratic system of government. The anti-democratic candidates in our electoral process are exploiting this division, and they're actively working to undermine the future of American democracy. National security leaders for America helped stave off that threat in 2020. We focused at that time on influencing veterans and undecided voters in battleground states. From June through the election day, our members engaged in countless interviews. They hosted campaign events, and they published 244 op-eds and 18 letters to the editor in major national and influential local media. 780 of the members signed an open letter to America endorsing Joe Biden, and it was timed to be released during our presidential debate cycle and resulted in several hundred media stories appearing nationwide, with particular focus on our battleground states. The letter became part of the dialogue at the end of the campaign about Joe Biden. And even the letter itself was mentioned by Vice President Harris on her debate stage in October of that year. In the middle of 2021, Pew Research released polling data that showed in 2020, Donald Trump saw a 16% loss in veteran support compared to what he had in 2016. That same polling showed that veterans made up 15% of the national vote. That meant that our group played a major part in 2.4% swing in the total vote. Why that's important is because that was the average across the entire country. It doesn't account for states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona, which have higher percentages of veterans. And so the swing, the impact was even greater than the 2.4% And why that's important is because all three of those races were run by President Biden by less than that percent. We thought that our efforts would end in 2020. But unbelievable and unfounded attacks on voter integrity, the very bedrock of American democracy, combined with the events of 6 January 2020, when insurrectionists stormed our Capitol, clearly demonstrated the need to maintain our bipartisan organization with a more focused mission of defending democracy against anti-democratic efforts. We are dedicated to opposing those who supported or excused the events of January 6th and those that work to undermine faith in our judicial system. We're opposed to those who continue to undermine our election integrity with unfounded claims the 2020 elections were rigged. And finally, our primary focus issue is on protecting free and open elections for all voters, no matter their race, their religion, or their background. In the United States, we have key midterm elections. They occur midway between the presidential elections. Most recent ones occurred in 2022, where we dedicated ourselves to opposing anti-democratic candidates. Our achievements were again led by a handful of volunteers. We supported over 30 Senate, House, gubernatorial, and Secretary of State races. Our members spoke at rallies and introduced candidates. For example, in the Georgia Senate race, our members spoke at and introduced the senator at a major veteran rally. Our members published multiple op-eds and letters to the editor. In Georgia, one of our op-eds was placed in a respected conservative media outlet, and that op-ed was read over 800,000 times. We provided various campaign staffs with video interviews of our members to help them get out the vote initiatives in their districts. And we partnered with advocacy and political action organizations to marry their funding resources with the credibility of our members to produce powerful advertisements in multiple mediums, including print, broadcast, and radio. Our work is far from over. While those midterm results were better than anticipated, they nonetheless prompted an expansion of election deniers throughout the political establishment. Indeed, the threats we face today are exponentially greater than those we faced in 2020. The return of Trump and his promise of vengeance, if elected, demonstrate that he and the other candidates like him are existential threats to our democracy. The reported policies that are being looked at for the next Trump administration would abandon America's commitment to global democracy and alienate some of our critical allies. At a key time in global security, those policies would cede the narrative to authoritarian regimes and further undermine the spread of democracy. We continue to see a proliferation of bills aimed at narrowing democracy at our state level by fostering unfounded allegations of voter fraud. Senior political leaders serve as apologists, if not promoters, to January 6th insurgents. This implied or explicit endorsement normalizes the use of violence as an accepted action should the vote not go the way the voter that lost likes it. We see significant challenges that remain. In 2024, we must use the credibility of our former senior national security leaders to educate voters on the fragility of their freedoms that are at the heart of American democracy. We must defeat anti-democratic candidates whose policies will bring forward greater authoritarianism in the United States. We are preparing now for an existential fight for the future of US democracy. We're aggressively recruiting to bring in even more former senior national security leaders to serve as spokespeople in different campaigns in 24. We're using our state teams to identify the most critical races where we can have an impact. We're actively seeking other pro-democracy groups that we can partner with in 2024. And we've stood up a super PAC, an organization that can take in large amounts of funding so they can independently pay for advertisements in the summer of 24 using our members' pro-democracy messages. And we're building out a state-of-the-art communications team that can rapidly respond to critical national and local issues within the very compressed media cycle. Finally, our strength has been the credibility of all our members and our bipartisan approach to pro-democracy issues and candidates. We believe that we can help restore confidence in the future of an American democracy that is once again a guiding light and a moral compass at home and abroad. We believe the threats we face in 2024 are something like we have never seen in our lifetimes. Each of us believe they present clear and present dangers to the future of US democracy. And in the end, our members remain bound by their oath, reflected here, that we will defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So that's really a quick overview of our organization. Sorry, I'm trying to get the stop share to work. As I said, this organization never existed before. In our culture, retired senior national security leaders are often encouraged not to talk, not to get involved in a political discussion. Retired admirals and generals in particular are under a great deal of pressure not to speak. We feel that this upcoming 2024 election cycle is like none other. This is not a traditional election to debate policy. As we said, we feel in 24, American democracy itself is on the ballot. And if we don't come forward now, when will we come forward? And so therefore, we are committed to doing everything we can such that the day after the election in 24, in November of 2024, none of us can wake up thinking that we could have done more should the results not go the way we hope. So that's really my overview. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Admiral. We have some extraordinarily distinguished guests here, and I'll invite my colleague Juan de Dios to introduce them. I just want to start with underscoring what you said, Admiral. This has never happened in the history of our country, at least since the Civil War. In that case, open warfare broke out. But certainly in the last century, it has not happened that a group of military leaders has said publicly that a particular candidate is an existential threat to American democracy. That's different than a policy disagreement, as you said, Admiral. This is something more fundamental. There's characterological quality in the president and in certain of his supporters that threatens democracy. So one question I would ask you is, what do you say to Trump supporters who say, well, the threat to democracy is coming from the hard left, it's coming from Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or some international conspiracy, and you and the other admirals are just part of the deep state, as it were, that, you know, the hidden underground forces. What do you say to an extreme Trump supporter conservative who doesn't believe he's a threat, but actually sees him as the savior of American democracy?
Well, Brian, I'll tell you how we answer that. And that is that they are not our focus. We know that anyone like that is so pro-Trump and has lived in that bubble that there's nothing our small organization of 1,000 people can do to change that. Our focus is specifically on the undecided voter. It's not, we will never change the far-right appeal that Trump has garnered. And nor do we feel that it's our job to energize the Democratic base. That's the purpose of the Democratic Party. Our message is singular and it's focused. It's focused on impacting the undecided voter. And in the case of the presidential elections, we're only focusing on the battleground states, those handful of states that could go either way. And if we can influence those undecided voters and make them understand that the freedoms they take for granted are part of democracy. You saw the polling where 50% of the folks under 40 are open to another form of government. That's because they believe that no matter what that form of government is, their freedoms will still be there. They don't understand that, no, some of those authoritarian regimes will take away those very freedoms that they take for granted. Now, we're also aware enough to understand that in the United States, democracy is not the number one priority. You know, the number one priority is the economy, or the number one priority is security, or, you know, so there's a list, but democracy ends up being 4 or 5 on that list. If we can focus on key campaigns, on key states, and make them aware that the opponent that we are fighting against, that anti-democratic candidate, represents such a fundamental change to their freedoms, maybe we can get that priority to go from 5 to 3. 5 to 3 will be enough to sway, we believe, enough of those undecided voters to maintain, for example, Georgia. In our country, In 2020, Georgia was lost by such a small amount of votes. Those are influenceable votes and well within our ability to have an impact. So we really aren't addressing the far right pro-Trump doesn't believe anything other than what he has to say. We're trying to go after the middle voter who doesn't exactly believe Trump all the time, but also maybe has other priorities. And we're going to try and help them understand that in those other priorities, democracy has to be higher than they're probably thinking about today.
Thank you, Admiral. I have other questions myself, but I want to open it up to our distinguished guests. I'm going to call on Juan de Dios Cinconegui to introduce whoever, call on people and introduce them.
Open to questions. You want to start? Yes, if you can introduce yourself, you can do it in Spanish or English. Como quiera. As you wish. It's a short question. I understand that the problem is focused on the democracy, but do you think that the problem is more focused in the political leadership? If you don't have new leadership, the new kind of leadership, you can do a lot of things, but probably you cannot change the results of the votation. I don't know what is your opinion.
I'm sorry, what was the last part? You're not able to change what?
You will not change the results of the votation for the candidates.
Election.
For the elections. Yeah. That's the issue. We have also election in the last week in Argentina, and we have a lot of examples that happens.
So again, I think if I understand it, how do we see these new leaders that are now entrenched in our democratic positions, and that the fact is that we cannot influence them? You're right. Because of our electoral college, our system of government, there are leaders that we will never be able to have an impact. They will always be reelected. Their districts are either arranged to ensure they always have a majority of their party, or they come from a state which itself is primarily Republican, which unfortunately under the influence of Donald Trump, those leaders tend to be very extreme. So there is absolutely nothing that we can do about those specific leaders. We have criteria that we go after. It has to be a close race. It has to be, polling has to say in the beginning that it's plus or minus 5%. We believe we can influence an election if it's within 5%. And there are enough elections within 5% that we can, at the Senate and House level, congressional level, we can make an influence, and we can keep the anti-democratic leaders in the minority. And we also believe that those close races at the presidential level will occur in those battleground states, which again, we think we can influence enough to keep them voting for whoever the Democratic nominee happens to be, but opposing Donald Trump.
Let me address that for a second as well, if I may, Admiral. There's a huge difference between voting for policy changes or even leadership changes and voting for a leader who wants to do away with democracy for the sake of personal power. Democracies fail when people use the system of democracy to gain power and then use that power to undermine the democracy. And Donald Trump has shown a willingness to do that. We've never had a president of the United States of America say, I am your retribution. I am going to punish our enemies, who has supported people in crowds beating up, thugs beating up protesters, who has made the kind of statements that Trump has, and who has said he will pardon, excuse the crimes of people who nearly killed United States Capitol police officers and who wanted to kill the Vice President of the United States of America and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and who continues to perpetrate falsehoods. This is not a policy matter. And that's, you know, the sense here, Admiral, has been difficult choices between an incumbent party that was widely viewed as corrupt and presided over a vast economic failure versus somewhat insurgent, if you will, a challenger from a libertarian background who didn't have a broad political base. The general sense was, well, we've got to throw out the old, that will elect the new guy. One of the things Donald Trump has taught us in the United States is you've got to be very careful. I'm not speaking about Malay one way or another. He's elected, but whoever gets elected as president can't undermine the democracy. It has to stop there. And that's not a policy matter. That's just, you can't say we're going to take away people's right to vote. You can't say we're going to punish our opponents. You've never heard it from Biden, from Clinton, from Obama, from, you know, the other Clinton, or from George W. Bush, or H.W. Bush, or Eisenhower, or even Nixon. So,
Congressman, we are going to continue with the people at the Zoom. Now is the turn of career diplomat Dario Polsky. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Admiral, for taking the time to speak with us. I was wondering, we spoke a little bit last week with one of the speakers about the narratives that are present in elections or that have been present in elections in recent years. And it seems like they're based fundamentally on sort of a dichotomy between democracy on the one hand, the let's say threat to democracy on the one hand, and the threat to freedoms on the other. And I was wondering to what extent your organization is exploring that narrative to sort of reach the narrative of the threat to freedom as opposed to the threat to democracy as a narrative in winning back in winning those undecided voters, in sort of exploring that narrative of framing the election as a threat to freedoms rather than as a threat to democracy or together with. Thank you.
No, you're exact. That's brilliant. That's exactly what we need to do. Our problem is that a threat to democracy is not tangible. It's not something that motivates the voter. You have to, as you just said, you have to take democracy and explain to them what that means. And that does get to their freedoms. And you're right. On the right, there's huge campaigns on freedom to bear arms, freedom of religion, and that they have been very successful at getting to the base feelings of the voter. And we know we can never get that level of emotional connection just talking about democracy. You have to say to the 50% who are open to another form of government, you need to say, wait, but we're talking about your freedoms. And that's what we have to connect to. And so, no, that you're exactly right. That's our huge challenge, is again, getting them to understand that. Because then I believe, or we believe, that the generic polling that says, people believe that democracy is in peril. What is your priority of that? And they'll say it's their fifth priority, which polling shows. Well, that's because they're not getting exactly what you said. They're not understanding that democracy equals freedom. And are you willing to give up freedom by electing authoritarian alternative. And again, we're assuming it's Trump. That's what we're going on. We'll reassess where we are if it's not. But if you look at the polling of the recent reporting of what his people are preparing to do when he comes in to power, it gets to those freedoms. It gets to things we've never talked about. Just today in our papers, it's talking about how he's looking at perhaps using U.S. military and police functions inside the United States. We don't do that. That is fundamentally un-American. We have a law against that. He will institute counters to that and claim that there are so many threats in the United States that justify that. Just the thought of that is why it's not in this election is not about policy. It's about those freedoms. And we need to make sure folks understand that and understand they don't want the U.S. Army on their streets telling them what they can do. But it's an uphill battle. I mean, the polling right now, if there were an election today, Trump would win despite all of this, because people just aren't relating to what it really means to them, we believe. And that's what we're trying to demonstrate.
Admiral, we are giving the floor to Ambassador Ricardo Lagorio. Please.
Thank you very much, Admiral. It's a pleasure. Admiral, you have referred to one dimension, I would say, of the challenge, the internal one. Allow me, as a diplomat, to look at through a different lens, the other side of the coin, and you as an admiral have traveled all around the world. You are rightly saying that from your point of view, the election of candidate Trump might be an existential threat. And that election, it's not only a possibility, but might be a probability. So how do you respond to the other side of the coin? Because we are in a moment that one of the, I would say, turbulence in the world is democracies versus autocracies. So how do you react to people abroad that are looking to the United States as a beacon of liberty, freedom, democracy, and might start perceiving that you're not playing anymore that role? And even if Trump is elected president, as you are saying, that is an existential threat. So how do you foresee, if that's the case, the role of the United States in this very, very critical environment?
Well, sir, I would say that as I tried to outline earlier, we agree completely with that. So if you're asking what would we do after or what would we do before, right now our focus is on making sure he's not elected. But certainly all of us, frankly, are much more comfortable having the discussion of the international relations impact of Trump policies, that look at his embracing of Putin, look at his comments about the Ukraine and what he might do. Look at his America First and what that might mean for other countries and what that might mean to embolden authoritarian figures throughout the world at the expense of democracy. I think that, my leadership team and I had a good discussion on this a few weeks ago, because there are many calls for folks to address international relations versus the presidential campaign. We will be available to make those comments and to have that discussion. But frankly, at the end of the day, we're focused on that undecided voter. And the undecided voter is already not all that aligned with this whole democracy thing to begin with, let alone try and talk to them about the international aspects of that and how we're going to embolden authoritarian regimes. So we have to prioritize our focus. And so right now we're focused on internal threats to democracy, to put special effort on that so we can really fine-tune that message, linking it to freedoms we just talked about. When we have the chance to talk, we will talk about the international implications. We will be up and running by this summer. No one really pays great attention, certainly not that undecided voter. Both bases do, but the undecided voter is not going to start focusing really until June, July, August timeframe. That's when we will be able to reconstitute our communications team, and we'll be able to, within the cycle, if something comes in, we'll be able to address that. And of course, again, we have so many ambassadors, we have so many senior leaders who have served overseas and have seen failed democracies. It will be very easy for them to speak to that. Unfortunately, it's just, we don't believe at the end of the day, it's going to have as big an impact on that undecided voter as we would hope it would have.
Almirante, I don't know if you have connected the interpretation. You will see the function in the...
I do, yes.
Yeah, you need to choose English. That's it.
Yes, I have English.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So it's the turn of Veronica Fiusa from the Argentine Army. Go ahead.
Hello, it's an honor to hear you about. I'm a legal advisor from the Army. El ejército. Lo voy a hacer en español, quizás para que se entienda más la temática o lo que propongo, ¿sí? Me parece sumamente inspiradora y estratégica, ¿no? La propuesta que hace el contraalmirante con ese grupo de líderes estratégicos retirados de las Fuerzas Armadas, ¿sí? Para participar en la calidad democrática de su país, ustedes han sido, desde la historia de Estados Unidos, han sido parte del sistema político porque se autolimitaron, ¿sí? Que no es la realidad histórica política de la Argentina, que ha vivido entre 5 o 6 golpes militares, ¿sí? Entonces, hoy por hoy, a 40 años de la democracia, le consulto al contraalmirante Smith, me interesaría muchísimo su opinión, qué recomendaciones o qué ideas fuerzas le podría dar a los retirados hoy por hoy de las Fuerzas Armadas Argentinas para que colaboren en la democracia de distintas maneras, ¿no? Así como líderes estratégicos que han tenido un montón de capacidades, ¿no? Y que no se autoexcluyan en función de una historia. No sé si se comprendió.
Yes, it was. Thank you. Again, it comes down to the difference between policy and a threat to your future of your government. It is how we look at it and though it has motivated the people to join together in our organization. Again, no one did this in 2000 when we had a presidential election and it was a difference in policies. So I don't know enough about your current election to understand if it's fundamentally a policy discussion or if it's a future of your government discussion. I think, though, that if, we came forward and we knew that the key to our influence would be maintaining a very reasoned and rational discussion. There are retired flag officers, generals, and admirals in our country who have gotten up on the big stages and made extreme statements that are polarizing. We know that we can't do that. So bringing together retired admirals and generals to talk responsibly about the future of your country, you know, that's what we believe is powerful. Perhaps that could work there as well.
Admiral, if I may add to that, if I can share my own thinking on that for a moment. It's so important to emphasize that none of your effort or any of your colleagues has been, let's undermine the civilian government so that military leaders can rule in an undemocratic way. In fact, it's been quite the reverse. It's military leaders saying, use the civilian democratic process to protect your rights against an individual who could undermine those rights, undermine the democracy. And that's what's so important. There's nothing any of you have said or done in your entire lives that has said the military should take over because we disagree with the civilian leader. What you're trying to say, as I hear it, is based on your experience in the world, and I don't think people talking about this, Admiral, but as military leaders, you spend your careers assessing the quality and character of people who are going to lead others into combat. You are thoroughly screened yourselves. You understand when a person might be dangerous because they don't use good judgment or they don't respect their responsibilities. And you're using those same skills here to convey your impression that one of our political leaders may be in danger. So it's not just you don't like his policies or the military knows better, as I see it. It's more, as people who have sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, as you said in your video, you see that Constitution under threat now. And if you didn't speak up, it would be inconsistent with your oath of service. Is that a fair portrayal?
Yes, that's very fair. And, you know, and again, it's all about, we don't want to wake up the day after and wish we had done more. None of us in any of our thinking is saying, well, when we wake up the day after, if it's not how we wanted it, we're going to go do something. That we just, all of us from day one are imbued in civilian control of the military. And, you know, I did a bunch of war games at the end of the last presidential election where they went over, what if Trump does this? What if the the Trump campaign does this other extreme action? You know, what will the military do? And there were many concerned people on those war games. And I was the military person on the war game. I'm like, no, you need to understand that at the end of the day, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of our military, will get together in a room and they will talk, and it will all be about defending the Constitution. They won't take an illegal order. They're going to do what's right and proper. And all of us believe that too. And at the end of the day, if the election is done and Donald Trump is the president, we will all be frightened. We will all question what is going to happen, but we're going to carry forward because he's our duly elected leader. And we'll hope to God that there'll be enough other constraints out there that we were wrong. We're confident we're not wrong, but we will hope if that's the result.
Thanks, Admiral. There is a question over there. Please introduce yourself. We have only about 10 more minutes, so please keep the next question brief.
Adelante, por favor. Mi nombre es Juan Lolo, soy abogado, y dos preguntas.
You got to be louder.
Pasado. La pregunta primera es ¿cómo ve el fenómeno de la desinformación, que es una amenaza global que se ha incorporado ahora, además del narcotráfico, del terrorismo, la desinformación como un fenómeno que pueda afectar la institucionalidad de los Estados Unidos a través de la asunción de un líder que no es democrático? Y después, ¿cómo ve usted el funcionamiento? Porque después de todo, la democracia es el medio para llegar al poder, pero luego funciona la vigencia plena de la institucionalidad, de la Constitución, que garantiza los controles a través de los distintos poderes que existen en la Constitución de los Estados Unidos.
Okay, let me address the first. It absolutely keeps all of us up at night is the disinformation. Add to that, as you're beginning to see artificial intelligence being able to add to that and amplify the disinformation, and it is frightening. So that's the world we're in. Certainly our small group is not going to be able to impact that. So we have to aggressively be out there countering the disinformation. But it also gets to how you are putting out our message. Disinformation, each side lives within their own bubble. The far right is living in our country on Fox television, and the far left is in MSNBC. That's where their worlds are. We have to get to the undecided voter who maybe watches both and doesn't understand it. Because if you're seeing one side's disinformation, maybe you're seeing the other. And we have to try and explain the difference. And luckily, so far, we still have credibility from our previous positions. Again, we have to guard that credibility, and we can't be extreme ourselves. To the last part, the constitutional controls and the separation of powers is exactly what we're counting on. So if we fail, and if in November, President Trump is elected, then we have to count on the fact that there's still an equal branches of government, both in our Supreme Court and in Congress. And unless there's it's physically impossible to change the dynamics in our Senate to give Trump's party, if he were elected, also a supermajority at this time. So we would have checks and balances to a certain level, and so that's what we have to count on. Again, from a policy perspective, our Supreme Court is often smeared with being far right. They're not smeared with being undemocratic, and they always come back to what the Constitution says. So we would rely on both the other branches of government to check the authoritarian tendencies, which we know he will try and impose.
Admiral, one quick comment on that. It's an excellent question you raised. Excellent. Our Constitution was largely designed to prevent the concentration of power in the executive at the expense of the Congress. And not only have we not seen a president like President Trump, we've never seen a Congress that was focused on loyalty to an individual as opposed to loyalty to the Constitution and and policy. And that's one of the dangers right now, is that the selection of the most recent Speaker of the House of Representatives, the leader of the Casa de Diputados, was a question about who's more loyal to Donald Trump. And even a very loyal Trump supporter was thrown out. So there's this fear that if he gets reelected, the so-called checks and balances that are so fundamental to American democracy for 200 plus years would be jeopardized, because the party in the House and the Senate would say, our job is to obey and support the president, whatever he says, which has never happened ever in our country's history. Juan de Dios.
You have the deep state in the United States. That's very vital. Admiral, I want to ask you about your organization, the National Security Leaders for America. Basically, a reflection between the difference and the convenience of being a bipartisan organization or being an independent one, in terms of credibility or to avoid eventual conflict of interest. Just that relationship between bipartisan or completely independent from politics.
Well, just because of the way our system uses words, it's hard. If you say you're independent and you're talking in a political construct, you are neither a Republican nor a Democrat, you're an independent. Or you could say you're an independent organization, you're not tied to anybody. So independent doesn't fit what we're doing because we have Republicans, we have independents, and we have Democrats. Our big debate actually was, are we bipartisan? Are we nonpartisan? And so we have no party affiliation. But by definition, we are going to pick a side. It doesn't have to be a Democrat that we support, but we will. The key is there has to be somebody who's anti-democratic. Like, we want to get involved in the Republican primaries so that we can support pro-democracy Republicans, and we want them on the ballot. When in our midterms in Georgia, we didn't get involved in the governor race of Georgia because both candidates were pro-democracy. And then we don't care who wins. We're not part of the Democratic Party. We want to defend democracy. So we chose bipartisan to demonstrate that we are a group of folks from all parties in America, and we are focused on defending democracy.
Thank you. Admiral, I have one other question, if I may, and then do we have any others from this room or online? Because we only have maybe. Can I ask you for one more moment, if I may? I know I promised you an hour. This has been fantastic. First of all, incredibly valuable lessons from a person who's dedicated his life to service, and that's the one part of the question I want to ask you. You and every person in your organization has taken a commitment to defend with your lives the Constitution and the freedoms that our Constitution guarantees. It's not just the Constitution. President Trump has said, and General Kelly has verified this, he's shown no respect for those who serve their country, who would put country over self. And you allude to this in the video, that for him, it's what can the country do for Donald Trump and his family and his power base. Can you talk a little bit about the contrast between the service ethic of yourself and the colleagues in your organization, and including the diplomatic corps, which is so important, versus how they see the recent tendencies, not only in Donald Trump, but in those who are supporting Donald Trump?
I think that the reason this organization exists is because of how shocking his statements have been to all of us. No presidential candidate ever, or former president, or serving president, has ever said the things that his close advisors have said he actually in fact said. His lack of respect for injured servicemen is reprehensible to everything America stands for. The most hallowed people and most revered people in our country are those that gave their life in service to our country. And next, slightly behind them, are those that were injured defending our freedoms. And that Donald Trump calls them all losers or suckers is just incomprehensible and completely motivates everything we're doing. We're an all-volunteer organization. All of us have other jobs. We are dedicated to spending however many hours we have to keep this man out of office, because he is not what America is all about. He's the antithesis of that. He's the exact opposite of what a president or a former president should be. And it's not a party. It's not a Democrat or a Republican. It's American, and he is anti-American.
Admiral, thank you. Any final thoughts you would have this audience of very distinguished individuals in a country that's just gone through an election and that has 40 years of democracy, but faced a difficult period, to say the least, before that came about? Any final thoughts from your experience to share with this?
You know, I think my recommendation would be to leverage the retired community of national security leaders to support your elected leader, and to say that let's give him a chance and let's see how he does in defending your way of governance, and to prevent those who just disagree with his policies from getting involved. It's where we were in 2016. Many didn't get involved because they wanted to give Donald Trump a chance. Within 4 years, he demonstrated that it wasn't a policy thing, and it became a cult of his personality. If your new president wants to try and move forward how your people have voted, then I think have a group that supports him in the beginning and sort of be the antithesis of the expected revolt of admirals and generals, and demonstrate that in fact it's the opposite, and that you embrace your governance system and you're there for them, and then you'll have even more credibility if it goes the way Donald Trump went, because you will have demonstrated that you started out supporting the results of your free and fair election.
What's the key guardrail for you, Admiral? At what point do you say to an elected leader, you're crossing lines here? That we are now concerned about your conduct, not just a particular policy, unless it's a policy that undermines democracy. But what should you guard against? What should you watch out for in a leader?
I think the narcissistic tendency that I have ultimate authority to do anything I want, irrelevant of what my Constitution says, or irrelevant of what the rules are in the House or the Senate, that's when you have to start to stand up. If they're well within the policy and they're well within what they're allowed to do, you just happen to fundamentally disagree with it, you got to just put up with it or turn the TV off. But once you start violating the very tenets, or even threatening to, or talking about how I'm not required to go by what the Constitution says, that's when you have to stand up. And frankly, that's why our members are standing up, because we're afraid that's exactly what will happen if the election goes in Donald Trump's favor.
So when a president makes it about themselves, and or any leader, it doesn't have to be the president, it's about themselves and not about the good of the country. When a president says, if I say it, it's the law, because the president has absolute authority. Or when a president says, I'll pardon myself, there's a long list of things the president can do. But at some point, when that person says, I'm no longer subject to the constraints of the Constitution or the laws of the country or what Congress requires, it's that kind of behavior and the requirement that people honor and worship the president, regardless of what he does. Those are that's when you begin to get concerned.
Absolutely. And that's our greatest concern. There were guardrails when he took over in 2016 because he brought in responsible people. He will not bring in those people if he's reelected. We know that. And it's really what keeps us up at night, because right now he'd be elected tomorrow, and American democracy will not be what it was yesterday.
And that is particularly precarious, as the ambassador asked about. It seems to me that when America is facing this level of uncertainty, the instability that creates for the world and the opportunity it creates for the autocrats, you have to be, having spent your life worried about how adversarial powers seize upon any weakness. That's got to be of grave concern to you and the diplomatic corps.
Absolutely. It's just absolutely shocking that we are where we are. And instead of spending our attention on those valid international challenges, we have an existential threat internal that we have to address right now.
Admiral, I want to thank you for taking so much of your time. Thank you for your commitment to public service in the military and continue to serve. We're honored to hear from you, and it's certainly timely and relevant. And there are comments in the chat here alluding to that as well. With that, Admiral, we're grateful for your time, and I'm incredibly grateful as an American that we have military leaders. I'll share with you finally to close. My sister and many people were very concerned about the last election. And my sister at one point said, is there going to be a coup? This was the last election where Trump was defeated. Is there going to be a coup? Is he going to order the military to take over? And I said to my sister, no, there's not. And she said, how do you know that? And I said, our military will never let that happen. That's just not what we're made of. And you all take that oath very seriously. And it was reassuring for me to know that, to know the professionalism, the character, the integrity, the lifetime commitment to service and to democracy that people like you have displayed. So let me thank you for that. It helps me sleep better at night to know there are people like you in our military and civilian life afterwards.
Well, thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to your class today.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. We'll let you retire now, Admiral, and we'll continue with the class very briefly. I think we're going to take about a 15-minute break.
Thank you.
We can't invite you, Admiral, but we'll have you come down here another time in person. It would be great.
Okay.
So
all right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Half the hour, okay? So we have a long time. Thank you. Opportunity. What a remarkable opportunity we just had with Admiral Smith. In about a half hour, we'll be joined by Stan McChrystal. I'm going to share with you 2 books of General McChrystal, because if I do it now, we'll have more time to hear from him, and I think he'll be okay with that. Stan McChrystal was head of the Joint Special Operations, which is the elite of the elite of our military forces. And his work was central to our strategy and our tactical efforts in Iraq and in Afghanistan. One of his, I think, the most powerful book he's written, I don't know if you can see it, I'll see that. Yep. It's called My Share of the Task. And it's a very humble and modest work about an extraordinary life of service. I don't know if it's available in Spanish, but it is an amazing, amazing work about his life and how and why he became a soldier, how he came to head special operations. And most importantly, I think he would say the character and the integrity and the courage of the special operators themselves is breathtaking. And the tasks they would do every night in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the complex coordination of all resources that we had. So we had signal intercepts of people's communication. We had drones flying over, tracking people. We had human intelligence trying to find out who was the conduit, and all of that to try to get people who were blowing up school buildings with truck bombs, who were assassinating political leaders, who were killing children, etc. And people like Stan McChrystal and the operators he led had some of the most difficult, demanding jobs in the world. They did it night after night after night after night, and they showed real progress. Another book, which is quite powerful, is a book he wrote about risk and how people can deal with risk in their communities and in their professional life. And then he has a third book on leadership as well. So we'll hear from him in just a moment. I want to put a little context, if I may, and I don't know if we'll have time to do this. Hang on one moment. I'm losing completely.
Ryan, later, if possible, I would like to listen to the experts, probably taking advantage of the presence of Ambassador Lagorio, about the non-member status of Argentina in the NATO.
If I don't want to put you on the spot, Ambassador. But
no, it's okay, it's okay.
Ambassador, I'm going to ask you to come and speak to this so people can see you better. Is that okay? We'll trade positions. And Juan, can you do the introduction?
Yes. Yeah, Ambassador Ricardo Lagorio. He has been ambassador in the Russian Federation and in many other places, countries. And
thank you very much. As we are talking about strategic issues, let me share with you something that is not well known. But sometimes we are ashamed to say that we are a major non-NATO ally. This is a category granted by the US government, by the Congress. In the case of Argentina, it was granted in 1998. We were the first Latin American country to have been granted that category. And it was the result of what Argentina did in the 90s. We were very active in, let's say, taking words of the UN Charter, investing in peace and security, international peace and security. I was Under Secretary of Defense from 93 to 96, and I had the honor to negotiate this category with Joseph Nye, who at that time was at the Pentagon with William Perry, a fantastic Secretary of State. And we, for instance, we had 3,000 peacekeepers per year in the world. Something that now I think that maybe we have 50 or 100 users. We created the first Peacekeeper Center in 1995. We had in the UN headquarters like 20 meters. And we participated in a lot of joint military maneuvers with the United States. I remember I was posted from 2003 at the Argentine embassy in Washington. And when the war in the Gulf, the second one, without the UN erupted, suddenly Argentinian officials that were spending 6 months or a year in the United States in a military camp, suddenly they appeared in Iraq. So I think that category, I hope that with the new government, we are going to go back to use that category. And another important thing...
Ambassador, can you explain that category just a little more?
Yes, it's major non-NATO ally. It means it has nothing to do with me being a member of the NATO. Nothing to do. Nothing to do. I would say it should be, and maybe sometimes the United States don't use it as a first circle of strategic allies. It is very positive because it allows to have access to used materials. For instance, in the 90s, last time Argentina bought airplanes. You know, we have an air force without airplanes, which is something very unusual, but it happened. And at that time, we bought 34 A4, and it was in the context of major NATO allies. It allows to a lot of things having to do with working with the military, working with defense, access to strategy, operativity, interoperability. So I think it's out of being part of the NATO. Has nothing to do. NATO is another geography. This, I would say, it's a functional category that should be and could be very useful to Argentina. I think that the last time we used it was at the beginning of the 2000s. Then we left it behind. And another important thing, Juan, Brian, is that next year we're going to host again the Conference of Ministers of Defense. The first one took place in Williamsburg in 95. At that time, I was also at the Ministry of Defense. That's something that was the result of a visit by Secretary of Defense William Perry to Argentina in 94. And in the final communique, we agreed to launch this conference. First one in Williamsburg, second one in Bariloche in 96. And since then, every 2 years, it takes place in a country. Next year is going to be the number 16, and it will take place in Argentina. And I think that's a very important moment to tackle a new approach to security. I think that that's something important, at least for me. I have several questions for General Chrystal. Being a diplomat, I think that we have weaponized too much diplomacy. We are tackling conflicts too much from a military point of view and not enough from a diplomatic point of view. That is why we have a lot of conflicts. None of them are being solved.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes. Quería ver si había algún traumatólogo.
Sí, especialista de qué necesita.
La pierna, tengo un golpe fuerte en la pantorrilla.
Vamos a apagar el micrófono.
En el Instituto de Ciencias Exteriores no se estudia dermatología. Diplomáticos seguimos para todo menos para dermatología. So I think that that's something maybe to discuss. One, what could be a good result for this ministerial, and to trying to have new concepts regarding global security. It's not anymore an international security, it's a global security. Thank you.
Excellent. Because for some, the two terrorist attacks that Argentina suffered was in some way related to the participation of Argentina in international operations. In my opinion, that's a risk, but because of that kind of risk, we cannot permit, because of the threat of terrorism, to not do something. So the opposite, we need to continue doing the same thing and doing it better if possible, and try to avoid the risk. But is there really a relationship between the terrorist attacks and the foreign affairs in the 90s or not?
I never saw any reliable data, so I don't agree. And as you came and mentioned this, in 1994, after the second terrorist attack, Argentina asked for a meeting of the Security Council to discuss terrorist attack as a threat to international peace and security. We are still waiting for it. So if we make an exercise in what if in 1994, the Security Council would have discussed terrorism as a threat to international security? What things could, if we have avoided if?
Thank you.
That's enough.
I have a question, if I may, if you're comfortable answering. Part of why I wanted to teach this course and come to Argentina is because I believe it's so important to improve U.S.-Argentinian relationships. And I believe we're in a global test right now between democratic free societies and autocracy. And I think it's so important that we work together with our neighbors and allies, not necessarily formally allies, but people and countries who care about democratic and free values. Can you talk about your hopes, or if there's your hopes and thoughts about continued improvement between the U.S. and Argentina as it moves forward, if you're comfortable?
No, I'm always comfortable. Thank you very much. And the best proof of what you're saying is that since this morning, the president-elect, after 9 days of being elected, is in Washington, D.C. So as you say, it's not words. I think that's a very clear demonstration of the importance. But we have, and we were discussing that coming up with a cup of coffee, not whiskey. So what we said, it's very important because we're not under the whiskey. We have a double challenge because yes, as you said, we have a struggle between democracy and autocracy, but at the very same time, many threats are global threats. And for that, we need, unfortunately, to work with autocracies. Environmental problems, migration. We have now more than 100 million people walking around the planet by forced migration. So how can we look for a perfect equilibrium between democracy and working with them. I think, as we discussed, the enemy is within. We have to strengthen democracy inside our countries, because otherwise we are giving a vulnerability for them. If we talk too much that our democracies are in existential threat, and it's perfect that it is, the perception is that, you see, democracy is not valid anymore. So the narrative that we have to come up is a very, I would say, sensitive one, putting together the necessity of recognizing the threat, but at the same time, not giving the threat as an opportunity for the outside.
The general is here. Oh, excellent. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you. Never General McPhee.
General McChrystal, I'm told, I'm not seeing you on my screen, but I'm told that you've joined the call. Yeah, the chair is there, the screen. And he's, yeah, he's there. All right.
Hi, I am the AV technician. Dan will be here in 12 minutes when he's scheduled to be on. Is that fine?
I didn't think you looked like Sam McChrystal.
No, I grew a beard.
Like David Letterman.
Are we good though?
You're fine.
5 o'clock Eastern here, so 12 minutes.
You're fine. You're fine. So that's wonderful.
Okay,
We've already done. I've already given an introduction of the general, shown his book, so that we can have more time to hear him speak. But that's fine. We'll have a brief discussion here. When he's ready, he can join us.
Okay, I'll cut the camera for now, and then I'll bring it back up when he's ready to go.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Where are they? I'm not sure exactly. Sí, creo que sí. So, any other questions for the ambassador? It occurs to me. From the audience as well. I don't know if there is one.
No, cuenta algunas experiencias así de las maravillosas que debe tener en su función a lo largo.
Yo creo que más interesante escuchar a General McChrystal, ¿no? Sí.
I'm going to share with you a very brief personal description about a personal experience I had related to the situation in Iraq, and I don't know if I've shared this with the group before. When the choice came from the Bush administration that we were already in Afghanistan, we had a tough battle there. And George Bush, as you know, essentially said, I think we need to go after Saddam Hussein in Iraq as well. I traveled to the region a number of occasions personally, met with leaders in the region, studied extensively the history of Iraq and current status, asked people on the ground what they thought. And it was my best judgment that it would be a mistake to invade Iraq, and I believe we needed to focus instead on Afghanistan. At the time, public opinion in the United States was somewhere around 65–70% in favor of invading Iraq. But in fact, what was happening was we were taking forces that were staged to go to Iraq and help or to go to Afghanistan and reshifting their focus to Iraq. So even to such an extent that when a big hurricane hit America and we needed desperately military sources to help us, the focus got shifted. But well, I'm going to pause the story. General, we see you've joined us.
I'm sorry, my AV guy was unmuting us. I was just hearing about Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm desperate to hear what you think, Brian.
And when I was sharing, and I sent you the information. By the way, I've shared this magnificent book with the. Do you know if it's available in Spanish, Stan?
Boy, funny. I took 8 years of Spanish and couldn't write 3 sentences. I don't know. I will check on that though.
It would be phenomenal. I think it's an amazing book. You obviously, I was just going to share with people that the personal experience, which I sent you a note, I don't know if you had time to read it some months ago.
I did.
But I was I was the only member of the House or Senate who opposed the initial invasion because I thought it would be a mistake, but then went repeatedly to the theater, met with people on your team and on General Petraeus's team, saw that we were making progress, that your special operators were paying the price, but making a huge difference. And I believe, based on those conversations, that it would be a moral and strategic mistake to withdraw prematurely. And went back home and said that, and it's hard to imagine, but the Democratic base was very opposed to the war. To now have their Democratic congressman say, even if the war going into Iraq was a mistake, you have a moral commitment and a strategic imperative. And frankly, we're making progress. And General, we had hundreds of my former friends and supporters showing up at town halls, yelling at me and, literally hands covered in blood, etc. But I still to this day believe it was the right decision to support you and the soldiers and the diplomats that were trying desperately every day to try to salvage some level of decent life for the Iraqi people and some level of dignity and security for our own people. And so, General, I have to say, it is such a profound honor to see you. I read all of your books. I followed your career with great admiration, and you would take your very valuable time to speak to us. We have with us today, General, members of the Diplomatic Corps from Argentina, current and former members of the Congress of Argentina, members of Congress from a number of other Latin American and Caribbean nations, and very distinguished scholars of American government and history. So and we have some 50 graduate students in programs in law, international studies, and political science. And it's such an honor to have you. And with that, I will, I've already done your introduction. So let me just invite you, thank you, and invite you to speak as long as you like, and then we'll follow it by question and answer. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's welcome.
Let me start by just thanking you for the opportunity, and please, I'm going to ask you to call me Stan. The general was my father, and so whenever I hear the general, I look over my shoulder in case my father might have come into the room. And interestingly enough, comment on your earlier point, I think you were right twice. I think invading Iraq was one of the dumbest things the United States ever did. But getting out of Iraq in the point when people got so excited to do that was also a mistake because the situation had changed dramatically. And so I think you got it right, but I do remember the passions of the moment. And of course, we see passions in different places around the world. I thought I would talk for just a few moments, just to sort of frame my background for people in the room and then throw a couple of issues on the table. But then I'd like to talk about whatever is of value to the people on the call tonight. The first thing is I was born into an Army family, because you read my memoirs, but my father was a soldier, as was his father, as were all four of my brothers, and my sister married a soldier. Then when I got married, I married the daughter of a career soldier whose three brothers were soldiers. Her sister was a widow of a soldier that I served with. So it was all Army. That's what I knew when I growing up. And so from a young age, that's what I was going to do. I was born in an Army hospital. I went to West Point at age 17, and I was in uniform until I retired in 2010 at age 55, almost 56. It was a great life. I mean, for me, it was a great organization with good values, patriotism, good comrades, interesting work, a sense of like being on a sports team. And I began my early part of my career as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. And then I got into special operations. And then I got into the counterterrorist part of special operations and stayed there for most of the rest of my career. That became my area of focus. I was in the first Gulf War in a Special Operations Task Force, but that was really, I'd like to say that war was not much about it, really. I mean, it was 100 hours long. In reality, life got complicated when we got into 9/11, post 9/11. And post 9/11, of course, we had the initial operations into Afghanistan, and then about 2 years later, the invasion of Iraq, which I've already commented on initially. A few things to go back for people who may not remember the moment as emotionally as it was. I was a brigadier general on September 11th, 2001, and I was actually doing a parachute jump on a Tuesday morning, a practice parachute jump, in fact, out of a new kind of an airplane. And right before we jumped out, they'd already opened the door, the wind is rushing in, and my boss and I are about to jump out of this thing, and the Air Force crewman near the door informed my boss that a plane had hit one of the World Trade Towers. And so we jumped. And when I got on the ground, a young sergeant who worked with me met me, and he came up and he said, another plane had hit the other World Trade Tower. And he said a bomb had gone off at the Pentagon, because that's what he thought in the moment. And then he looked at me and he said, sir, I think everything's changed. And interestingly enough, for my life, for more than the next decade, and for many other people, much more than that, in fact, had changed. The experience of going into Afghanistan was something that, in the moment, it was driven by the emotion of the 9/11 attacks, the films of the towers falling, of innocent people jumping out of skyscraper windows to their death. And it created this visceral reaction, this desire for action, this desire for revenge. And so the United States started with initial operations into Afghanistan when the Taliban-run government would not deny safe haven to al-Qaeda, which were inside Afghanistan. And so the United States began military operations in Afghanistan, theoretically to go after al-Qaeda, but that involved overthrowing the existing Taliban-run government in Afghanistan. In retrospect, although the initial operations were fairly easy, it wasn't hard to convince the Taliban government, many of them, to switch sides. The military side of the campaign was not particularly difficult, although most of the senior al-Qaeda escaped. They escaped into Pakistan or other places. We were able to upset their safe havens. The criticism that I have of ourselves in the rearview mirror is, in fact, I could argue that we rushed to failure. We went forth into a country that had a history of being called the graveyard of empires. Of course, the British had had trouble there twice. They'd been run out twice. The Soviets, with our logistical help to the Afghan Mujahideen, had fought for a decade and, in fact, pushed the Soviets out at the end of the 1980s. And yet, as we went into Afghanistan, we went without much knowledge of Afghanistan. We went with very few people with any language skills, any cultural linkages, any sense of context for the complexity of the situation. Because at a distance, it looked like a Taliban government harboring al-Qaeda terrorists, fairly straightforward. But in reality, Afghanistan was, after 20 years of internal civil war and fighting against the Russians, was this series of competing forces led by warlords, different factions, some were religiously based, some politically, some criminally based. And so it was this complex weave of a society that didn't reflect traditional Afghanistan at all. And then there was neighboring countries, Iran to a degree, but to a much greater degree, Pakistan, who was deeply involved in what was happening. And we went in the United States relatively naive, with good intentions. We went in, overthrew the government, the Taliban government, pushed out al-Qaeda, And then there was a desire that we would pull out right away. But at that point, it was practically impossible because there really wasn't a government of Afghanistan to stand up. We created what they call a loya jirga to create one. And then in the fall of 2001, began the regime of President Karzai. But it was clear that it was a society that was in tatters in terms of welfare of the people, the economy, all of the institutions essentially were destroyed. And so the West, led largely by the United States, found itself needing to stay there and start to do this complex nation-building task, which then later turned into a counterinsurgency against the Taliban, who were resurgent. And of course, it lasted 20 years. We weren't prepared mentally for it. We weren't prepared in terms of policy-wise. We didn't prepare our government or our institutions or the American population for a commitment of that length and the nature of that. And so if I take away great lessons, it is never to underestimate the size or difficulty of a task at hand. And once you are in there, there's always a temptation to look at it in short-term challenges that you are trying to overcome, when in reality, there is a larger requirement that you have to fulfill. Now, we got better at it over the years, but the reality it wasn't until about 2008 or 2009 that we really started to get focused, the West, in helping Afghanistan. And by that time, there was a huge gap between what the Afghan people had hoped for and what we were delivering. And so it became an almost classic case of a government that was besieged with corruption, inefficiency, a loss of talent, and not a lot of natural resources, trying to become legitimate in the face of pressure. And the Afghans didn't do it. Now, partly it was the fault of the West, but it was an awful lot the fault of the Afghans as well. So I couldn't point at a single entity that bears full responsibility, but I would say most of the players didn't get it right. And as a consequence, what we have now is what I consider is a really difficult situation in Afghanistan, because the Taliban government, I hope, will improve over time. But it's a pretty extreme regime under which that the average Afghan has to live. Fortunately, in the 20 years that we were involved, much of Afghan society did progress. Girls in school, young people, greater education, different expectations. So I like to believe that the generation that has been growing up in the last 2 decades are not likely to accept that kind of regime indefinitely. I think that there will be too much pressure on the Taliban regime to either change, reform, or be overthrown over time. But we'll see if I'm correct. Iraq was different, completely different. We went into Iraq in the spring of 2003 because there was this frustration with Saddam Hussein going back to the first Gulf War. So more than a decade before, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. We'd pushed him out, but then he ran an autocratic dictatorial regime. And so after 9/11, pent up frustrations on the part of some policymakers in the United States tabled the idea that we would invade Iraq. It was a bad idea then. It turned out to be a bad idea later, because as bad a leader as Saddam Hussein was, I don't think he was a big threat. I don't think he was a big threat to us, or really to anybody, except to a small degree, his local neighbors. His dictatorship mostly just oppressed the Iraqi people. And so I think over time, he would have lost power naturally through forces inside the country. But be that as it may, we invaded in 2003. We overthrew the government and the army pretty quickly. And that was easier than I think we thought it would be. But then after that, there was an expectation that we would pull our forces out quickly, and an Iraqi government would emerge in the wake of that and it would be in a position to provide competent leadership for the country. But after decades of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, there wasn't this government in waiting ready to take over. In fact, there was not much that you could put together that would, at the local or larger state level, create the kind of order and governance that was competent and legitimate with the people. And then the Iranian influence on Iraq was enormous. And no matter how many troops the West put in, the United States did, the Iranians had proximity. They were there, and they could simply say, when the Americans leave, we will still be here. And so that dynamic was huge. And then inside this, that wasn't there before the fall of Saddam Hussein, arrives Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as it became known, wasn't Al-Qaeda originally. It was a separate organization led by a guy named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. But he created this organization that later aligned with Al-Qaeda. And pretty soon, he became Al-Qaeda's major arm. The biggest activity Al-Qaeda conducted in the 2003 to 2009 period was led by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So in fact, what had happened is our wider war against Al-Qaeda moved to Iraq. It moved to that battlefield, you could call it. And that became an essential and decisive fight against Al-Qaeda, in that case, in the identity of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it was an incredibly bitter fight. I led our counterterrorist forces for 5 years, and we fought every single night. In fact, from about 2005 through 2008, we were doing 300 raids, just my force, a month. We were doing 10 every night. And so the amount of violence, the amount of the ferocity of the fighting in the counterterrorist fight is hard to describe to people, because from afar, I don't think people had an appreciation for just how difficult that got for an extended period. And Brian, as you described, we got in there and we made every mistake you could make in the first year or two. And then after about 2 years, we started to figure out, okay, we have got to figure out what we are going to do to try to get a legitimate Iraqi government in place, to push back Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to give the Sunnis an opportunity to stand up and sort of rejoin Iraqi society. And it was this bitter struggle for several years to do that. But starting about 2006, we really started to figure it out. We started to perform better. We started to understand the Iraqi people. We started to do the kinds of things that made it an effective campaign. It was late, but we did that. And so over time, by really the end of 2008, we were able to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so there was a period from that time until about 2010 when it looked like things could go in the right direction. And then, of course, a couple things happened. America pulled all our forces out with Iranian pressure on the Iraqis. And then ISIS were the embers remaining from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They billowed up again. And all of us remember how ISIS shocked everybody by, in fact, even threatening all the way down to Baghdad in 2014. So I'll stop here. Really the message that, or the lessons that I took away from my experience is the United States has an extraordinarily effective military and a very professional force, and I was incredibly proud to be a part of it. But that did not make us immune from making mistakes. Military forces try to do what they're good at. As the saying we said, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so the desire is to do those things which you are strong at because they are familiar to you. So we tried to do a lot of that. We did some things that were big military operations that should have been very small interactions with the people. We didn't develop the cultural acuity, the ability to understand their religion, their society, their language. And so it made us foreigners always. And when you are trying to operate in a country like that, lacking that ability to connect to the people is just, it's a recipe for huge problems. So we made a lot. At the end of the day, I'm proud of the things that we learned and we were able to do, but we could have done it with many fewer issues had we began a little more thoughtfully. So let me stop there, and I'd love the conversation to go wherever people are interested.
And thank you for that. I want to start with really an observation, if I may, from having read your book. One thing that impresses me about you as a person, and I've seen this of virtually all our military leaders, is the openness to self-reflection and self-criticism. There's not a sense of, I have to say everything we did was right or everything was wrong, but there's an honest appraisal of what did we do well, what were our mistakes? And I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit. That seems to me to be part of our military leadership culture. And I think it's hugely important and vastly underappreciated by the general public in America or around the world. Can you comment a little about that?
I can, and I think you're right. I think generally it's a strength. It's not uniform across. There are people who don't, but generally it is. And I would point back to during the Second World War, the U.S. Army, which had expanded dramatically, implemented something called the After-Action Review. And it was designed to understand what had happened in a battle so that they could draw lessons from it. And what they found is, to do an after-action review, they would interview every participant in a small fight. And what they found is everybody had a different view of the battle, a different version of the battle, because they'd all seen it from a different angle. For people who remember the story of the blind men and the elephant, where one touches a leg and describes the elephant as a tree, one touches the toe, describes the elephant as a snake, and so forth. Nobody is being dishonest, but everybody's view was incorrect because it was limited. And so this process brought together a more complete picture of the battle, always imperfect, but more complete. And then from that, they would establish, okay, here's as close to truth as we can find. Now, why did it happen? What went well, what went poorly? We kept that tradition after World War II, and in fact, really expanded it in the early 1980s. So when I was a young captain, we would go out to the desert at Fort Irwin, California, and do these very realistic war games. And then they would have brutal after-action reviews. I mean, you would have the actions of your unit just dissected, and they'd point out what you'd done wrong. And it was a searing experience. Some of these after-action reviews would go on 4 hours long. And you would walk out of there exhausted, but you would vow not to make those mistakes again. And so from the early 1980s to about 2000, we remolded the United States Army, which was badly damaged after Vietnam, and created many of the strengths which showed up later in the first Gulf War and whatnot. And so I think that's one of the places where this culture of reflection came into the force. And I think it's largely still there today.
Well, one other question, if I may, because I'm having read your book, when you talk about the difficulty of the special operations forces and the risks and professionalism that were involved in that, can you talk a little about the amazing efforts that you and your forces undertook, your operators, to try to minimize civilian casualties? Because it was really extraordinary. And it's another story that doesn't get told. Of course, every casualty by a non-combatant is a tragedy, but the effort you went to and the risks your people endured in order to try to minimize that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and sometimes that's not fully appreciated. And I explain it in this way. There are really 3 reasons to try to prevent civilian casualties. The first is legal. There's something, law of armed conflict. So if you do things that violate the law of armed conflict in the US military, you will be tried and prosecuted. But actually those laws are a bit liberal. So for example, if somebody shoots at me from a house, I have the legal authority to destroy that house with an airstrike because I've been threatened from that house. The second is moral. It's what's right. And that has to be not just inside each individual, it's got to be woven through the force. Are we living according to a set of standards that we all believe are as good as they can be? Values. And that has to be constantly reinforced across the force because war pulls you down to the dark side. The last consideration is really practical. And that is, if you are trying to win a fight that is counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, the common denominator is ultimately you will lose unless you can win the support of the people, unless the people will give you information. If the people will give sustenance and refuge to the enemy, then it is almost impossible to win. And so one of the ways to avoid losing the support of the people is not to harm them. If you do operations which kill civilians, every civilian you killed is not a single casualty because they have brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, friends, all of whom it resonates with them and it creates a sense of bitterness and resentment. In fact, you could argue that if you do something that is intentional or even unintentional, you will create a groundswell of resistance to you. So every time you do that, you pay a price. And because our enemies and the populations thought that we had precision weapons, they assumed that everything we hit was what we were looking to hit. And so they assumed that if we did kill civilians, it was intentional. And so we had to be extraordinarily careful because ultimately, you've got to convince the population that it's in their interest for our side to win. And that's a difficult argument to make and to win. But it begins with do everything you can to protect them, not harm them.
Thank you very much, General. My name is Ricardo Lagorio. I'm an Argentine diplomat ambassador. I was posted in the United States from 2000 to 2003. So I went through 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan. And so let me ask you the following question. In your book, Team of Teams, you said that we abandoned many of the precepts that had helped establish our efficacy in the 20th century because the 21st century is a different game with different rules. The only person I think that stated this was the former French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin, when in that famous speech at the Security Council, February 14, 2003, having Colin Powell sitting next to him, give the advice not to invade Iraq. You just referred to people. So the question is the following. In the context of the new rules, aren't we weaponizing too much the political answer and reacting just with the monopoly of force when you need other things? In the big majority of conflicts, you are not just dealing with states, you are dealing with people and public opinion worldwide. And I feel, General, that we are losing the narrative because we are weaponizing too much the political answers.
Yes. but I'll give a little bit more, but I agree. One of the challenges is the military is a relatively easy tool to use. It has a chain of command, it has logistics, it has weapons, it has people who will respond. And political leaders can point the military at something and say, attack this or do whatever. And it also gives you the feel that you are doing something. It gives you the reassurance of action. The problem with that is it's very simplistic, meaning everything you do military creates some positive outcome and many negative outcomes. As we talked about with the use of force, you get resistance to it, you get xenophobia inside local populations. So there's a lot of reasons to understand that the value of military force is very discreetly limited. The problem with all of the other parts of power, diplomacy, what we would call soft power, the use of values of the United States, economic interests, sometimes intelligence community actions, and now more than ever, information operations, is they are more subtle in terms of being tools. They take time to prepare diplomats to operate in an area. They take intelligence operatives to go out and develop networks and connections. Information operations traditionally took people who are understood the landscape in which you're operating and then could very effectively communicate into that. Nowadays, we've got artificial intelligence, which helps. But I would argue that in current wars, take Ukraine, I would argue Ukraine is about 80% information and 20% actual military fighting. That's what is going to determine the outcome in Ukraine. We could talk about the same with Gaza, because it's not what is happening on the ground that matters the most. It's how everybody who sees or hears about it processes that, whether they become a supporter of one side or the other, or if they put pressure, many of the things. And so this is the fight for the minds and the hearts of people and of governments. And so that's what I think we have to get dramatically better at. And unfortunately, an advantage of a country like Russia now is with an autocratic regime, they have more control over that. They don't have a better message, but they can control it in an easier way than most democratic societies have been able to do. But I agree with your point.
Dario Polsky. Please introduce yourself too, Dario.
Yes. Good afternoon, General. My name is Dario Polsky. I'm also with the Argentine Foreign Service. And I actually have two questions, if I may. The first one is, I think, very much related to Ambassador Lagorio's question, which is, I think it was former Defense Secretary James Mattis who was famously reported as saying when speaking before Congress that if you don't fund the State Department sufficiently, then I need to buy more ammunition. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see that trend between assigning, let's say, Defense Department resources and State Department resources to particular situations, how you see that evolving in the coming years, considering also the political context. And the second question is, well, I'm logging in from New Delhi, so I sort of have to ask how you see the current relationship between the US and India sort of as a counterbalance to China. And specifically, one item that caught my attention was the agreement to build the jet engines, the engines for the F-414 jets in India. How you see that decision? Thank you.
Now that's great. You may have to help me reminding me whichever of the questions I forget as I answer. I'll start on India first because I am the least knowledgeable about that. I think that the relationship between India and the United States is on a collision course in a good way, meaning that there was the period of non-aligned nations in the 50s and 60s, but I think that with the rise of China and the leadership of President Xi Jinping, there's a natural push that is pushing India and the United States closer together. And that, I think, is positive. And I think building jet engines there as we start to overlap our economies more, because the rise of the Indian economy is pretty impressive as well. It's not perfect, but it is moving at a velocity that is powerful. And India is taking its place more or less in the world. And again, I think that India has got a tremendous number of political challenges like every big nation now. But the reality is, I think our relationship with India will continue to strengthen because we have shared interests. We both have a desire to have amount of stability that right now China doesn't seem to be able to offer. Let me go back to your, remind me the first question, just a couple words on it.
Just how do you see the relationship between the Defense Department and the State Department?
Yeah.
As far as dealing with either let's say the hot conflicts that are going on right now, but also in a broader sense.
Yeah, it's something that Jim Mattis was completely right on. About 20 years ago, a writer wrote a story, and I don't know if you've read it. It's called The Military Coup of 2012. And it was a not true story, it was fiction. But the story was the United States military had gone into the Balkans and then had gone into other activities around the world. And the State Department and other parts of the whole of government were always weak. They couldn't do much. So the military had to do more of it because they had more logistics, bigger chain of command, more capability. And as a consequence, at a certain point, the military got to the point says, well, we're going to do everything. We might as well call the shots. And so they execute a coup. Now, I don't believe a coup is in the offing, but I saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military was the 800-pound gorilla in every case. When I commanded in Afghanistan, my last assignment, although there's an embassy there and there is other elements of U.S. Foreign Service, they were always undermanned. They had very little ability to get out and operate around the country doing aid programs and whatnot. And so the military, we had that capability, so we did it. Now, as a consequence, that dynamic occurs where the military is doing things that the military is not particularly well prepared for. They do their best at it. And the State Department and other parts of the government are underfunded and under-resourced for, so they do less, so we become imbalanced. And what Jim Mattis is referring to, I think, is completely correct. If you become imbalanced, like an athlete, if your arms are very strong and your legs are very weak, you're going to use your arms more. And so as a consequence, the default response around the world tends to be, we'll do the military because we don't have time for the State Department to get up to speed. So his point really is we have under-resourced our State Department, our wider diplomatic effort for quite a long time. And I think that we need to rebalance that. But there's not as much constituency in the US population to spend money on the State Department because there is a natural support for defense because it is jobs, it is weapons contracts, it is all those economic drivers all around the country that make it politically very popular. And so there has to be a push to better support the other capabilities in the government.
And our next question comes from a gentleman named Suraj Shamim, who is actually a student here in Argentina, but he is from Afghanistan, and he has an interesting perspective. He also speaks. What's that? I'm sorry? Yes, his status. Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. I misstated his status here. He's a status of a refugee here. That matters a lot. I was careless with my words. But Suraj is a remarkable young man, speaks, I think, 12 languages, and speaks both Spanish and English better than I do. So I'm jealous on two fronts. Suraj, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, I welcome General to this meeting, to this class. And thanks from Brian Burke, Congressman, and Professor Juan Medios for inviting me to this classroom. As a representative of Afghan youth, I born in 2000, a year before the intervention of the United States to Afghanistan. And we are really thankful for what the United States did for the youth generation in Afghanistan, because it was the goal of US, it was defense, but then they changed to support democracy as well. And we are really proud and thankful from you. And as a human rights defender, I always wished for the opportunity to meet you in person and discuss some questions regarding your leadership in Afghanistan, particularly concerning the well-being of civilians. And also about the young generation, as you mentioned, that what we will do. I just want to mention that young generation don't accept these Taliban, but with imtihan, we cannot do anything. With the corrupted government, with the government of, we can say, the Mr. Ghani, or also the Clase, which they were corrupted, and the Ghani also got the government by corruption. He was not elected by the people, and we can give example of Dr. Abdullah and Ghani, which they had, like, the people want support and didn't support Ghani as much as Abdullah, but he got the government because he was corrupted, and yeah, he got the government. And another thing, that now the Taliban has the modern weapons. How do you think that the youth with empty hands, yeah, we have knowledge, but we don't have anything to combat against these people who combat against 40 countries. And in my opinion, it will be very difficult because they don't support human rights, they don't recognize human rights, and as we can say, they close the schools. How we can combat against these people? And my question is considering about the recent rise of the Taliban and their access to modern weapons. By your previous leadership, how would you approach the complex dynamic of the region differently this time, specifically if you have the opportunity to go again to Afghanistan, because the threat still exists. Taliban still support many terrorist groups in Afghanistan. What do you think, how you can use your previous knowledge in order to make to contribute a more stable and sustainable future for Afghanistan as well? Because when you are going to Afghanistan for defense, to eliminate the threat to the United States, and also you need to also think about the people that they are living there. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, and I wish you the very best going forward. I know how difficult your personal journey has been and will continue to be for a while. I'd also throw on top of your question, if people watch what is happening in Pakistan right now, the Pakistani military, who were accused for decades of supporting the Taliban, have now had the Pakistani Taliban essentially turn out to be a real threat in the federally administered tribal areas. And so I think that they are at least feeling the pain of helping to create and nurture something that now is turned against them. The reality is America was involved in Afghanistan in the 1960s and felt very good about some development programs and whatnot. Then the Soviet Union came in greater numbers, supporting the government in the 70s, and then, of course, intervened at the late 1970s. And the United States supported the Mujahideen, the groups, through Pakistani ISI for almost a decade. And when that finished, America felt very good about itself. It felt that it had created Russia's Vietnam. And so it felt like we had won a fight in the Cold War without fighting directly, although 1.2 million Afghans died during that decade, essentially as Cold War surrogates for the two major powers. But the United States then went into Afghanistan, which you'll remember, after 9/11, not because the Afghan people invited us, but because Taliban had done that. And so we sort of lurched into Afghanistan with good intentions, but with, as we spoke earlier, not a great plan. And Afghanistan's political structures were already destroyed, as you know, from the village level on up through the tribal level and whatnot. There was not an infrastructure of effective governance. And so when we tried to help the Afghans put it together, with President Karzai, President Ghani and all, it was always problematic because of corruption and other weaknesses. The Taliban, however, were never popular, as you know, even in the time when I was there. They were a military threat, but they weren't a very popular threat. What they did have was proximity to the people. They were from those areas. They understood they were going to be there after any Westerners left. And so it was clear to everyone that whatever the Afghan government could do, it would have to do by itself or largely by itself over time. Now, I think it's unfortunate we pulled out completely. I think we could have left a very small force and probably helped the Afghan government retain control. But over time, the government had to get rid of or had to reduce corruption, had to become more effective, or it would never be truly legitimate for the people, as you know. It would just not have the kind of support that a nation needs. I think that what's going to happen going forward, we've got to recognize reality. The American people will not support going back into Afghanistan, at least not for the memory of most of the people who are grown right now, because there is just this sense that it is an impossible task for outsiders. I think that there's potential for a movement inside Afghanistan, and I know there's been a nascent movement with the Northern Alliance and remnants there to rise up against the Taliban, but it will take outside help. It would take help again from the West and probably from Pakistan to make that possible, to make that something that could work. But the Taliban, in my mind, although they are a strict regime, they've got weaknesses. They'll never be popular, in my view. They will always have a tide of resentment against them. So I think that there is potential for that. But I don't think we or anyone can expect the United States to come in with forces or even large logistics aid for a resistance movement in the near term. I just think the appetite of not just the United States, but the West is just too low. I wish it was different, but I don't think it is.
Please, go ahead. Yes, Contraalmirante, go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Colonel Brito from the Argentine Army. It's a great honor to share with you this talk. But my question is going to be for a global vision. The Western global competence is being tested very deeply right now. And we, the military, know well that we cannot front on the entire front. What will you be the priorities to contain this war that is going towards persistent disorder? Thank you.
Yeah. Kubernetes, thanks for your question. Thanks for your service to your nation through the Army, and it's an honor to be on with you. I think your assessment is correct. We are going to have, at least for the next decade or two, we're going to have this very heated competition. It feels like a Cold War, but it's a different construct. In my view, there will be multiple threats that the West, and I say the West, that's really all of the developed non-China, Russia, Iran world, is going to have to increase the effectiveness of our partnerships. Our alliances are going to be much more important because it's not logistically or economically or military feasible to do this as single entities. If I was to rank the problems or to describe them, I think that, interestingly enough, Russia is maybe the smallest. They are a danger. Ukraine is important, and I believe it's important that Ukraine wins and that Vladimir Putin loses. But I think in losing, that will mean regime change in Russia. I don't think Vladimir Putin can retain power if he loses in Ukraine. which we're not sure what will happen if he loses power. We don't know what will follow. But I still think Russia is the smallest threat because they've got a number of economic weaknesses and demographic weaknesses. So we have to contain them in the very near term. And I think we can do that. We've done it well so far, but the West is acting tired and seems to be losing energy. So we need to renew that in Ukraine. I actually think the second biggest threat comes out of the Mideast and Iran, because the spread out nature of the threat and the very emotional feel that we saw after 9/11, and then we saw after the Arab Spring in 2010, and now we're seeing connected to events in Gaza, there is a restlessness in the populations of the region. And many of the nations that have kingdoms or other governments, I don't think are as stable as anyone would like them to be. And I think Iran is very interested in destabilizing as many as they can. And of course, Iran is focused against Israel as well as against other neighbors. So I think that the chances of another explosion in the Middle East, bigger than just what we see in Gaza or on the northern border with Hezbollah, those are all very, very dangerous situations that could go viral quickly. And so it could take a lot of focus for the world to deal with that. And that could last a long time because of the nature of it. The most dangerous is clearly China, and not because China is necessarily evil. China is a competitor, and China's competition wants to establish as much control internally as it can, because the Chinese Communist Party still has some challenges there. They have expanded their technological capability where an invasion to something like Taiwan is now feasible. And whether they could do it effectively or not is unsure. But the reality is the likelihood of that happening goes up the more confident that they feel. And so I think that the West, not just the United States, but starting with the Southeast Asian, the Pacific nations, are going to have to focus on counterbalancing China. And as long as China has an autocratic president for life, Xi Jinping, the danger is he could find it in his interest to do things like create violence because it helps him politically. A democracy doesn't really have that advantage, but he would. And he's a 70-year-old autocrat who has promised to get Taiwan back during his time in office. And so I pay great attention to what he says. I can't guarantee he'll do it, but I think the danger is quite high. But thank you for your question, sir.
It's not Admiral or General Juan de Dios Sigonewi, who is my friend and colleague and the leader of the Interparliamentary course of study here, very active, by the way, in the Interparliamentary Union, something which, as you probably know, the U.S. helped start the IPU, but we're no longer members. And one of my personal beliefs is we need to get back into those multilateral relationships. Juan has done remarkable work, but he has a question next. I invite him.
Thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you very much, General, for your generosity and for being here talking to us today. I just want to ask you about basically BRICS. You know, we had elections two weeks ago, and one of the big discussions in Argentina was about BRICS, yes or no, because the ruling party until the 9th of December accelerated the incorporation of Argentina as a member of the BRICS. So a partner of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with a group of countries including Iran. So I want to understand, first of all, your view in the geopolitical stage of what it means to be a member of BRICS from your point of view, but also because you talk about the importance of communication. I think that it's not clear for the public in general. I think that could be a good strategy of communications to to let the people understand what means these kind of alliances. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. And thank you for what you've done. And I think I understood the question, but if my answer indicates you think I didn't, please stop me and correct me. I'm going to attach this to something, Brian, that you said, because I think multilateral and broader alliances and organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and whatnot are by nature frustrating, because the larger the group, the more difficult it is to get agreement, consensus, cooperation, and joint action. But they, in my mind, are essential. The first is you establish relationships through those interactions. And in times of peace or in low-level crisis, they can seem disorganized, they can seem weak, but in times of greater crisis, as we've seen with NATO, with the invasion of Ukraine, there is a force that pushes them closer together. And although it may be slower and more frustrating than we'd like, it creates a power that no single nation can create. One of the things that was effective in Afghanistan when I commanded there, I was the NATO commander and I was the American commander, but there were actually 46 nations in the coalition. And people said, how can you possibly do anything with 46 nations speaking different languages, different equipment? It was challenging. But in the other hand, it was clear to the Afghan people that we were never going to be a colonial power because we were 46 nations. And so I think that there is a strength to alliances that comes from the idea that you don't have a single dictator. You don't have a single ideology that is taking you one direction or another. It's a forcing function to be more diverse, and therefore, I think, ultimately stronger. So I think for countries like Argentina and the United States, we went through a period a few years ago where we reflexively started criticizing NATO and saying we were going to get out of things. And I think that was the wrong direction to go. In fact, I think that we should be in as many relationships as we possibly can be, because they form that essential network that gives you power and effectiveness. But please correct me if I didn't focus on the question well enough.
Another part of that question, General, maybe a little bit in kind of a different direction. That was several months ago, the BRICS, which of course, Russia, China, South Africa, Brazil, invited several other new countries to join, as you know, Argentina being one, but the others being Iran and Sudan, or Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, UAE. And one of the questions was China, Russia, Iran, these are not friends of Western democracies. And so the incumbent administration, which was just pretty soundly defeated in the election last Sunday, a week ago Sunday, was making favorable relationships, and the outgoing president with Russia actually was, seen shaking Putin's hand and giving him the heart signal, etc. The incoming president has spoken quite adversarially, at least at one point, about China and Russia as dictatorships. And so one of the questions now for the incoming president is, should Argentina become involved with the BRICS, given their human rights record and given their autocracies, etc.? So that, I think. And you can also mention, but we have been talking with Ricardo Lagorio about NATO and Argentina in the 90s, because this is a comeback in some way. Yes, and there's a parallel corollary to that, Stan, and it is, how can the United States, in your opinion, connect more strongly, not only with Argentina, but with other democracies in the region, given that we have a mixed history, to be perfectly honest, in the past, but now we have, I think, changed our own value system in general and overall. And I think, anyway, so sort of a two-part thing, what's your take on the BRICS, but also perhaps just as importantly, how can we improve relationship, collaboration, partnership between the US and Argentina, but then with the broader Latin America, Caribbean region? That's a big question.
Yeah. No, it's a great one, though. I'll start with the bottom line is the United States is a flawed partner for anyone, a flawed ally, because there are things we do which will irritate people. We can be, I sometimes liken us to a big puppy. I think our intentions are generally positive, although business and other interests push us, but we kind of wander around and knock things over. Argentina is a flawed ally as well. Every country is a flawed ally because our internal politics and our internal nature are such that we are always going to be imperfect fits with anyone else. But I would argue that interaction is the most important thing, even with partners that you have frustrations with, you have arguments with. But when you look at the BRICS situation, you are at some point judged by who your friends are. And if you ally too closely with China and Russia and Iran and others, at some point you will be put into that category by the world. And not just militarily, but also in terms of trade, in terms of economic interaction. People just won't want to do business because you are part of an entity that is viewed as negative and dangerous, and I think ultimately is weaker. So I would argue that both the United States and Argentina and other countries need to step back from the emotions sometimes, because the histories are pretty checkered. But you know, the history, you have to recognize it's there, but the history is not the future. The future is what we have to pay attention to and go forward with. And I think we can do that. So sometimes lower the frustration a little bit, or lower the rhetoric on all sides, even with our enemies. I think at some point it just doesn't do any good to people don't typically do better when you criticize them. So you can feel the frustration, but I think it's better to keep the rhetoric down and follow your values.
And I want to finish with one related. I want to drill down on this a little more. As you know, China, Russia, even Iran are making real efforts and real inroads in Latin America and in other regions. How do you think the United States, and what role can our military play in a constructive way to create a stronger pro-democracy, pro-freedom kind of alliance? It's not a formal alliance, at least collaboration, because of geopolitics and the geomilitary strategy, I think is disconcerting right now.
Yeah, it is. A quick story, back in 1991, the United States passed an amendment called the Pressler Amendment. And that was in response to Pakistan setting off a nuclear weapon. And because we didn't want them to. And what we did was we ended all military to military interaction, along with a lot of other interaction between the United States and Pakistan. And we thought we were punishing Pakistan. Well, I would go to Pakistan after 9/11 when I served over there. And you would run into military officers who were of an older generation, more senior, who had been to the United States for training, or Americans had been to Pakistani military schools, and we'd had interactions. They'd become friends, and your interaction with them was really good. But then there was a generation that was younger that had not participated, and they were much more hardline. They were much more difficult for us to deal with. And it just taught me there was absolutely no advantage in cutting off the interaction with people you disagree with. Because in fact, the best things we can do, I remember the School of the Americas used to exist first in Panama and then at Fort Benning, Georgia. And it would bring students from all over North and South America. And they would go through joint courses and things like that. And the key thing is they just got to know each other. Now, there were some flaws in the programs. It wasn't perfect, but trading military attaches, sending training missions, doing military exchanges. The military can have relationships that can be a step away from politics, because all military members ultimately hate politicians. And so each of them complain about their own politicians. And there's so many similarities. It gives you an opportunity to create some pretty positive interactions. And so I'm a great believer in keeping those as robust as possible, because when other interactions get weak for political or economic reasons, you can fall back on some of those relationships. People know each other and whatnot. And so I would argue very strenuously that we ought to use those. Now, they don't replace diplomacy and they don't replace economic interaction, because I think that's important. The United States needs to invest around the world, not just because it's a way to make money, but because it's a way to interlock economies. Economies that are mutually dependent tend to get along better because they are tied to the same outcomes. And so I think those ties are very positive, whereas I think China putting a tremendous amount of money around the world is very dangerous. And they're getting control of critical resources is equally dangerous.
Ken, you've been most generous with your time. We know how busy you are, how valuable your time is. Any final comments? We only have about 2 more minutes. Any closing remarks you want to make before we let you go with our great, profound gratitude?
Well, my gratitude for what you are. One of the things that I learned in my career, particularly in my last assignment with 46 nations, as you go around, you know, you can be partners in things that matter. You don't have to agree on everything. You don't have to have the same religion, same background, same language or anything. You can partner on things that matter. And that is a step toward the things we need to be. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity today and for all that you're doing.
Dan, thank you so much. Really a remarkable presentation.
Thank you, sir.
One other note to the participants in this call on this class, on Friday morning at 10 o'clock here at Austral University, the special envoy from the United States to address anti-Semitism will be giving a talk at 10 o'clock here. It will be a similar format in the sense of hybrid. So if people want to come in person, they are most welcome. We'd love to have you here. Our ambassador, Mark Stanley, specifically asked if we would be interested here at Austral and hosting this individual. He's a very distinguished member of our foreign service. And obviously, Juan is putting up his bio. So I hope some of you will join us. It's not open to the general public. It's just for participants in this class and a few other classes at the University of Austral. But a very important portfolio and a very distinguished speaker. And thank you. I hope to see you all here at 10 o'clock tomorrow. I don't know which classroom. Do we know that yet?
Yeah, it's going to be in the library.
In the library.
Number 8.
In the library. So, and we will circulate the invitation on Zoom. With that, I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions. I hope I didn't miss too many people, but very grateful for your participation, the distinguished people who joined us here, and what a remarkable evening we've had together.
Great. Thank you very much.
See you all. Next weekend, the class will have a woman named Beth Novak, who is with a group called GovLab out of the US, one of our universities, studying the future of government as it pertains to technology with issues like we heard from Marcy Harris, artificial intelligence. How can you have remote participation from the public using technologies? Can we manage a remote Congress, etc. So another great speaker for next week as well.
Don't forget about Sol.
And Sol, of course, we have to thank Sol and Pilar. Sol, wonderful job. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very, very good. Bye. Yeah.